Hello everyone, and welcome back to Deep Chronicles World. I know many of you use these videos to help you relax and fall asleep. So before you drift off, let's do something fun. Take a moment to leave a comment and share where in the world you're listening from. I'd love to hear from you. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like the video and hit that subscribe button. It really helps. Now, let's get cozy, unwind, and dive into tonight's tale. Ready? Let's begin. Joe Crouch's life began in 1943 in the small, unassuming city of Tennessee, a place where the rhythms of life moved slowly and dreams often took a backseat to practicality. Born into a middle-class family, Joe was surrounded by relatives who worked in accounting and finance. World of numbers and spreadsheets that felt both familiar and stifling. His parents, hardworking and pragmatic, expected him to follow in their footsteps, and for a while, it seemed he would. Joe excelled in mathematics and economics, showing a natural aptitude for problem-solving and analytical thinking. But beneath the surface of this logical, number-crunching exterior was a dreamer with a deep passion for music. It all began when his mother bought him a small radio for his birthday. Atia became his gateway to a world of melodies and rhythms. A world where he felt truly alive. He would spend hours listening to the latest hits, his imagination running wild as he dreamed of one day becoming a musician. By the time he was a teenager, Joe had taught himself to play the piano, often sneaking away from his family to practice on any instrument he could find. His talent was undeniable, and he quickly became known in his community as the boy who could make a piano sing. But Joe's passion for music wasn't just a hobby, It was an escape. It's growing up in a family that valued practicality over creativity. Joe often felt out of place. His parents didn't understand his obsession with music, and they certainly couldn't afford to buy him a piano. But that didn't stop Joe. He would visit local music stores, charming the owners into letting him play their instruments. It wasn't long before he started performing at small venues, his confidence growing with each performance. It was during his teenage years that Joe met Betsy, a girl with a voice as beautiful as her smile. The two quickly became inseparable, bonding over their shared love of music. Betsy would sing while Joe played the piano, their performances drawing small but enthusiastic crowds. They dreamed of one day making it big, of leaving their small town behind and becoming stars. But life had other plans. By the time Joe was 17 and Betsy was 16, they found themselves facing the realities of adulthood. Betsy became pregnant with their first child, Jay, and the two decided to get married. It wasn't the glamorous life they had imagined, but they were happy. Joe took a job as an accountant at a small investment firm, while Betsy worked as a receptionist at a local hospital. They struggled to make ends meet, but their love for each other kept them going. Over the years, Joe's career began to take off. He started his own investment company, using his sharp mind and natural charisma to attract clients. Betsy continued to support him, encouraging him to pursue his dreams even as they raised their two children, Jay and Patricia. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, cracks were beginning to form. Joe's success in the business world came with a price. The stress of running his own company, combined with the pressures of providing for his family, began to take its toll. He started drinking heavily, using alcohol as a way to cope with his mounting anxiety. It wasn't long before he discovered gambling, a dangerous habit that would ultimately lead to his downfall. At first, it was just a few friendly bets with friends. But soon, Joe found himself spending more and more time at the casino, chasing the thrill of the win. He began taking out loans to cover his losses, using his company as collateral. Betsy, unaware of the extent of his gambling problem, continued to support him, believing in his ability to turn things around. But things only got worse. By the early 2000s, Joe's company was on the brink of collapse. He had amassed over $100,000 in debt, and his creditors were closing in. Desperate, he began writing bad checks and selling off family heirlooms to keep the wolves at bay. But it wasn't enough. In June 2001, Joe received a call from the district attorney, informing him that his assets would be seized within a week if he didn't pay his debts. On the night of June 24, 2001, Joe and Betsy went out to dinner with their family. It was a rare moment of happiness, a brief respite from the chaos of their lives. But as they returned home, Joe knew he couldn't keep the truth from Betsy any longer. He sat her down and confessed everything: the gambling, the debts, the lies. Betsy was devastated, unable to comprehend the depth of his betrayal. The next morning, Joe made a decision that would change everything. He woke up early, his mind made up. He couldn't bear to see Betsy suffer any longer, and he couldn't face the shame of losing everything they had worked for. Tears in his eyes, he placed a pillow over her face and pulled the trigger, whispering, "I love you," with each shot. After the murder, Joe fled, leaving behind a trail of destruction. He began robbing small stores and banks, using the money to fund his life on the run. Over the next 2 years, he pulled off over 30 heists, becoming one of the most wanted criminals in the country. But his luck eventually ran out. In March 2003, he was arrested in Florida and sentenced to 50 years in prison. Joe claimed he felt no remorse for his actions, believing he had mercifully ended Betsy's suffering. But the truth was far more complicated. Joe's story is a tragic reminder of how easily a life can spiral out of control, and how the choices we make can have devastating consequences. Joe's descent into gambling began innocently enough, the few friendly bets among colleagues after work. It was a way to unwind, to escape the pressures of running his own investment company. But what started as a harmless pastime quickly spiraled into an all-consuming addiction. The thrill of the win, the rush of adrenaline as the dice rolled or the cards were dealt, became an obsession. Joe found himself spending more and more time at the casino, often staying late into the night, chasing the elusive high of a big payout. At first, he managed to keep his gambling under control, or so he thought. He would set limits for himself, vowing to walk away after losing a certain amount. But those limits were quickly forgotten as the losses piled up. Desperate to recoup his money, Joe began taking out loans, using his company as collateral. He convinced himself that it was just a temporary setback, that he would win big and pay everything back. But the wins never came, and the debts continued to grow. Betsy, unaware of the extent of Joe's gambling problem, continued to support him, believing in his ability to turn things around. She saw the stress he was under and tried to help in any way she could, taking on extra shifts at the hospital and cutting back on household expenses. But no matter how much she sacrificed, it was never enough. Joe's addiction was like a black hole, consuming everything in its path. By the early 2000s, Joe's company was on the brink of collapse. He had amassed over $100,000 in debt, and his creditors were closing in. Desperate, he began writing bad checks and selling off family heirlooms to keep the wolves at bay. It wasn't enough. In June 2001, Joe received a call from the district attorney, informing him that his assets would be seized within a week if he didn't pay his debts. The news hit Joe like a ton of bricks. He had always been a man who prided himself on his ability to solve problems, to find a way out of even the most difficult situations. But this time, there was no way out. He was trapped, cornered by the consequences of his own actions. That night, Joe and Betsy went out to dinner with their family. It was a rare moment of happiness, a brief respite from the chaos of their lives. But as they returned home, Joe knew he couldn't keep the truth from Betsy any longer. He sat her down and confessed everything: the gambling, the debts, the lies. Betsy was devastated, unable to comprehend the depth of his betrayal. She had always believed in Joe, had always trusted him to do the right thing. Now, that trust was shattered. The next morning, Joe made a decision that would change everything. He woke up early, his mind made up. He couldn't bear to see Betsy suffer any longer, and he couldn't face the shame of losing everything they had worked for. With tears in his eyes, he placed a pillow over her face and pulled the trigger, whispering, "I love you," with each shot. After the murder, Joe fled, leaving behind a trail of destruction. He began robbing small stores and banks, using the money to fund his life on the run. Over the next 2 years, he pulled off over 30 heists, becoming one of the most wanted criminals in the country. But his luck eventually ran out. In March 2003, he was arrested in Florida and sentenced to 50 years in prison. Joe claimed he felt no remorse for his actions, believing he had mercifully ended Betsy's suffering. But the truth was far more complicated. Joe's story is a tragic reminder of how easily a life can spiral out of control and how the choices we make can have devastating consequences. The morning after Betsy's death, Joe woke up in a haze of guilt and desperation. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket, but he knew there was no turning back. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. With trembling hands, he packed a bag with essentials cash, a change of clothes, and the revolver he had used the night before. He left the house quietly, avoiding the gaze of his children, who were still asleep. Unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded in their home, as he drove away, Joe's mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. He knew the police would soon discover Betsy's body, and it wouldn't take long for them to connect the dots. He had to disappear to become someone else entirely. His first stop was a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. He paid in cash, using a fake name, and locked himself in the room, trying to come up with a plan. Over the next few days, Joe's life became a blur of paranoia and fear. He avoided public places, staying hidden in the shadows, constantly looking over his shoulder. But he knew he couldn't stay in one place for too long. He needed money, and he needed it fast. That's when the idea of robbing a small convenience store first crossed his mind. It was a desperate move, but he felt he had no other choice. Late one night, Joe walked into a dimly lit store, his face partially hidden by a hoodie. He approached the cashier, a young man who looked barely out of high school, and pulled out the revolver. His hand shook as he demanded the money from the register. The cashier, terrified, complied without hesitation, handing over a few $100s. Joe grabbed the money and fled, his heart pounding in his chest. It was the first of many robberies he would commit over the next 2 years. Each heist was meticulously planned, with Joe carefully selecting his targets and timing his moves to avoid detection. He targeted small businesses and banks, places where security was minimal and the risk of getting caught was low. But as his confidence grew, so did his ambition. He began to take bigger risks, robbing larger banks and even jewelry stores. The money he stole allowed him to live a life of relative comfort, staying in nicer hotels and dining at expensive restaurants. But it was a hollow existence, devoid of any real meaning or purpose. Joe's life on the run was a constant cycle of fear and adrenaline, with no end in sight. He changed his appearance frequently, growing a beard, cutting his hair, and even wearing disguises to avoid being recognized. He used fake IDs and aliases, moving from one city to another, always staying one step ahead of the law. But despite his efforts, the guilt of what he had done never left him. He would often wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, haunted by the image of Betsy's lifeless body. He tried to drown out the memories with alcohol and drugs, but nothing could erase the pain. As the months turned into years, Joe's crimes became more brazen. He began to see himself as untouchable, a master criminal who could outsmart the police at every turn. But his luck was running out. In March 2003, after pulling off a particularly daring heist, Joe made a critical mistake. He used a credit card. linked to one of his aliases, and the police were able to trace his location. Within hours, they had surrounded the motel where he was staying. Joe knew the game was up. He surrendered without a fight, his once defiant spirit broken. As he was led away in handcuffs, Joe couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The life of running and hiding was finally over. But the weight of his crimes and the memory of Betsy would stay with him forever. Joe's capture in March 2003 marked the end of a 2-year crime spree that had left a trail of devastation in its wake. The police had been closing in on him for months, following leads and piecing together clues from his numerous heists. His final mistake, using a credit card linked to one of his aliases, gave them the break they needed. When they surrounded the motel where he was staying, Joe knew there was no escape. He surrendered without resistance, his once defiant spirit broken by the weight of his crimes. As he was led away in handcuffs, Joe felt a strange mix of emotions. There was fear, of course, and regret, but also a sense of relief. The life of running and hiding was finally over. Akala, he was taken to a local police station where he was interrogated for hours. At first, Joe tried to maintain his composure, sticking to the fake identity he had been using. But the evidence against him was overwhelming surveillance footage from his heists, witness testimonies, and the credit card transaction that had led to his capture. Eventually, he broke down and confessed to everything, told the police about the murder of his wife, Betsy, and the series of robberies he had committed to fund his life on the run. The details of his crimes shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Joe's trial was a media sensation, with news outlets across the country covering every twist and turn. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded killer and a ruthless criminal, while the defense argued that he was a man driven to desperation by his gambling addiction and mounting debts. But the evidence was damning, and the jury had little trouble reaching a verdict. Joe was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, armed robbery, and fraud. The judge sentenced him to 50 years in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led out of the courtroom, Joe's face was a mask of resignation. He had known this day would come, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. The reality of spending the rest of his life behind bars was a heavy burden to bear. But even in prison, Joe couldn't escape the memories of his past. He would often lie awake at night, haunted by the image of Betsy's lifeless body and the sound of his own voice whispering, "I love you," as he pulled the trigger. He tried to distract himself with books and music, but nothing could erase the guilt that gnawed at him. Over time, Joe became a model prisoner, earning the respect of both inmates and guards. He used his knowledge of finance to help other prisoners manage their money and plan for their futures. But despite his efforts to atone for his crimes, Joe knew he could never truly make amends. The lives he had destroyed, the pain he had caused, it was all too much to bear. In the end, Joe's story serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily a life can spiral out of control, and the devastating consequences of our choices. Life in prison was a stark contrast to the chaos and adrenaline of Joe's years on the run. The routine was monotonous: wake up, eat, work, sleep, and the days blurred together in a never-ending cycle. But for Joe, the hardest part wasn't the physical confinement, it was the psychological toll of his actions. The guilt and regret weighed heavily on him, manifesting in sleepless nights and recurring nightmares. He would often wake up in a cold sweat, the image of Betsy's face haunting him. In his dreams, he relived the moment he pulled the trigger, her lifeless eyes staring back at him as he whispered, "I love you." The sound of his own voice echoed in his mind, a cruel reminder of the irreversible choice he had made. Joe tried to distract himself by immersing himself in books, music, and work assignments, but nothing could silence the voices in his head. He began to reflect on his life, tracing the steps that had led him to this point. he thought about his childhood, his passion for music, and the dreams he had once cherished. He remembered the early days of his marriage to Betsy, when they were young and full of hope, building a life together despite the odds. But those memories were tainted by the knowledge of how it had all unraveled. Joe's gambling addiction had been the catalyst, but he knew it was deeper than that. It was his inability to face his problems, to ask for help when he needed it most. He had been too proud, too stubborn to admit that he was in over his head. And now he was paying the price. In prison, Joe found himself grappling with questions he had never dared to ask before. Was he inherently a bad person, or had circumstances pushed him to the edge? Could he have done things differently, or was his fate sealed the moment he placed that first bet? These questions haunted him, but they also forced him to confront the truth about himself. Over time, Joe began to open up to a prison counselor, sharing his story and his struggles. It wasn't easy. He had spent so many years hiding behind lies and masks, but it was a step toward healing. The counselor helped him understand the root causes of his addiction and the impact it had on his life and the lives of those around him. Joe also found solace in helping others. He used his knowledge of finance to assist fellow inmates with budgeting and planning for their futures. He even started a small music program, teaching others to play the piano and sharing his love for music. These acts of kindness gave him a sense of purpose, a way to make amends for the harm he had caused. But despite his efforts, Joe knew he could never truly atone for his crimes. The lives he had destroyed, the pain he had inflicted, was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. In his quieter moments, Joe would think about Betsy and their children. He wondered if they could ever forgive him, if they could find peace despite the tragedy he had brought into their lives. He wrote letters to them, pouring out his heart and expressing his remorse, but he never sent them. The words felt inadequate, unable to convey the depth of his regret. As the years passed, Joe grew older and frailer, his once strong body weakened by age and the toll of prison life. But his mind remained sharp, filled with memories and reflections. He often thought about the choices he had made and the paths he could have taken. He wondered what his life might have been like if he had sought help sooner, if he had been honest with Betsy about his struggles. But those were questions without answers, and Joe knew he had to live with the consequences of his actions. In the end, Kay's story is a tragic reminder of the power of addiction and the importance of seeking help before it's too late. It's a story of love and loss, of dreams shattered and lives destroyed. But it's also a story of redemption, of a man who, despite his flaws, tried to make amends and find meaning in the aftermath of his mistakes, while Joe grappled with his guilt and regrets in prison. His family was left to pick up the pieces of the life he had shattered. Betsy's death had left a gaping hole in their lives, and the revelation of Joe's crimes only added to their pain. Jay and Patricia, now adults, struggled to come to terms with the fact that their father, the man they had once looked up to, was capable of such heinous acts. The betrayal cut deep, leaving them with a mix of anger, confusion, and grief. Jay, the older of the two, had always admired his father's intelligence and ambition. He had followed in Joe's footsteps, pursuing a career in finance, and had even worked at his father's company for a time. But after Joe's arrest, Jay felt a profound sense of disillusionment. He questioned everything he thought he knew about his father and struggled to reconcile the man he had idolized with the criminal he had become. Patricia, on the other hand, had always been closer to her mother. Betsy's death hit her especially hard, and she found it difficult to forgive Joe for what he had done. She withdrew from her family and friends, burying herself in her work as a way to cope with her pain. But despite their differences, Jay and Patricia leaned on each other for support, united by their shared grief and the need to navigate the aftermath of their parents' tragedy. The years that followed were not easy. The media attention surrounding Joe's trial and the public scrutiny of their family added to their burden. They were constantly reminded of their father's crimes, and the stigma of being related to a notorious criminal followed them wherever they went. But slowly, with time and therapy, Jay and Patricia began to heal. They learned to separate their father's actions from their own identities, recognizing that they were not defined by his mistakes. They also found ways to honor their mother's memory, keeping her spirit alive through small traditions and acts of kindness. For Jay, this meant dedicating himself to helping others struggling with addiction, using his father's story as a cautionary tale. For Patricia, it meant pursuing her passion for music, a gift she had inherited from her mother. Together, they worked to rebuild their lives, finding strength in each other and the love their mother had always shown them. But the scars of the past remained a constant reminder of the pain they had endured. They rarely spoke of Joe, and when they did, it was with a mix of sadness and anger. They wondered if he ever truly understood the extent of the damage he had caused, if he ever regretted the choices he had made. They received the letters he wrote but never sent, finding them among his belongings after his death. Reading his words, they felt a flicker of the man he had once been, a man who loved them, who was deeply flawed but not beyond redemption. In the end, Jay and Patricia found a way to move forward, carrying their mother's memory with them and finding peace in the life they had built. But the shadow of their father's actions would always linger, a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of making choices with care and compassion. Joe Crouch's story is one of tragedy, but it is also a story that carries important lessons about the dangers of addiction, the consequences of unchecked ambition, and the importance of seeking help before it's too late. His life serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily a person can lose their way when faced with overwhelming pressure and despair. Joe's descent into gambling and crime was not an isolated event. It was the result of a series of choices, each one leading him further down a path of destruction. His inability to confront his problems, to ask for help when he needed it most, ultimately cost him everything: his freedom and his sense of self. But Joe's story also highlights the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the pain he caused, those he left behind found a way to heal and rebuild their lives. And Patricia, though deeply scarred by their father's actions, emerged stronger and more determined to create a better future for themselves. They learned to forgive, not for Joe's sake, but for their own peace of mind. They also became advocates for mental health and addiction awareness, using their experiences to help others avoid the same fate. Joe's time in prison, though marked by guilt and regret, also showed glimpses of redemption through his work with fellow inmates and his efforts to make amends. He demonstrated that even the most broken individuals can find a sense of purpose and meaning. His story reminds us that it's never too late to change, to seek forgiveness, and to try to make things right. But perhaps the most important lesson from Joe's life is the power of honesty and vulnerability. Had he been open about his struggles? Had he reached out for help instead of hiding behind lies and masks? His story might have ended very differently. His journey underscores the importance of addressing mental health and addiction issues with compassion and understanding, rather than shame and judgment. In the end, Joe Crouch's legacy is a complex one, a mix of pain and hope, destruction and redemption. His life serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of our choices, but also as a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the possibility of healing, even in the face of unimaginable loss. Joe Crouch's story is not just a personal tragedy. It also sheds light on broader societal issues, such as the stigma surrounding mental health and addiction, the pressures of financial instability, and the flaws in the criminal justice system. His descent into gambling and crime was fueled, in part, by the societal expectations placed on him as a provider and a businessman. The pressure to succeed, to maintain an image of stability and success left little room for vulnerability or failure. This pressure is not unique to Joe. It is a reality faced by countless individuals who struggle silently with addiction and mental health issues, afraid to seek help for fear of judgment or shame. Joe's story also highlights the need for better support systems for those battling addiction. His gambling problem spiraled out of control because he lacked access to resources and support that could have helped him address his addiction before it destroyed his life. This lack of support is a systemic issue, one that affects millions of people worldwide. By sharing Joe's story, we can advocate for greater awareness and investment in mental health and addiction treatment programs, ensuring that no one has to face these challenges alone. The criminal justice system, too, plays a role in Joe's story. While his crimes were undeniably serious, his case raises questions about how society deals with individuals who commit crimes as a result of addiction or mental health struggles. Joe's 50-year prison sentence, while justified in the eyes of the law, also reflects a punitive approach that often fails to address the root causes of criminal behavior. A more rehabilitative approach, one that focuses on treatment and reintegration, could potentially prevent others from following in Joe's footsteps. Finally, Joe's story underscores the importance of empathy and understanding in addressing complex social issues. It is easy to judge someone like Joe, to label him as a monster or a failure. But his life was far more nuanced than that. He was a man who loved his family, who had dreams and passions, but who was ultimately undone by his inability to confront his demons. By approaching stories like Joe's with compassion and a willingness to understand, we can create a society that is more supportive, more just, and more capable of preventing such tragedies in the future. One of the most poignant lessons from Joe Crouch's story is the critical role that community and support systems play in preventing personal and societal tragedies. Joe's downward spiral was marked by isolational lack of open communication with his family, an unwillingness to seek professional help, and a sense of shame that kept him from reaching out to others. This isolation was not entirely his fault. It was also a reflection of the societal stigma surrounding addiction and mental health. In many communities, there is still a pervasive belief that struggling with such issues is a sign of weakness, a failure of character. This stigma creates a barrier that prevents people from seeking the help they need, leaving them to battle their demons alone. Joe's story could have been different if he had felt safe and supported in admitting his struggles. Imagine a world where addiction is treated not as a moral failing, but as a health issue, where individuals are encouraged to seek help without fear of judgment. In such a world, Joe might have found the strength to confront his gambling problem before it consumed him. He might have been able to lean on his family, friends, or community for support, rather than hiding his pain behind a facade of success. Communities have the power to create this kind of environment, one where people feel seen, heard, and valued. This starts with education, teaching people about the signs of addiction and mental health struggles, and how to respond with empathy and understanding. It also requires investment in accessible resources, such as counseling services, support groups, and addiction treatment programs. By normalizing conversations about mental health and addiction, we can break down the barriers that keep people from seeking help. Joe's family, too, could have benefited from stronger support systems. Betsy, Jay, and Patricia were left to navigate their grief and trauma largely on their own, with little guidance or assistance. This lack of support is all too common for families affected by addiction and crime. By providing resources for families in crisis, such as therapy, financial assistance, and community outreach programs, we can help them heal and rebuild their lives. Ultimately, Joe's story is a call to action for communities to come together and create a culture of compassion and support. It is a reminder that no one should have to face their struggles alone, and that by lifting each other up, We can prevent tragedies like Joe's from happening in the first place. Joe Crouch's life was a complex tapestry of love, ambition, failure, and redemption. It is a story that defies simple categorization, one that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the society we live in. On one hand, Joe was a man who committed unspeakable acts, betraying his family, taking the life of the woman he loved, and leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. On the other hand, he was a man who, in his own flawed way, sought redemption and tried to make amends for his mistakes. His story is a reminder that people are not defined by their worst moments, but by the sum of their choices and actions. It challenges us to look beyond the surface, to see the humanity in even the most broken individuals. Joe's life also serves as a powerful testament to the importance of second chances. While his crimes were unforgivable, his efforts to help others in prison and his reflections on his own life show that change is possible, even in the darkest of circumstances. His story encourages us to approach others with empathy and understanding, recognizing that everyone has the capacity for growth and transformation. But perhaps the most enduring lesson from Joe's life is the importance of taking responsibility for our actions. Joe's downfall was not just the result of external pressures or societal failures. It was also a consequence of his own choices. By owning up to his mistakes, both in prison and in his final reflections, Joe demonstrated the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. This act of accountability, though it came too late to undo the harm he had caused, is a crucial step in the journey toward redemption. In the end, Joe Crouch's legacy is a complicated one, a mix of tragedy and hope, destruction and renewal. His life reminds us of the fragility of human existence and the profound impact our choices can have on ourselves and those around us. It challenges us to strive for better, to build a society where no one has to face their struggles alone, and to never lose sight of the humanity in even the most flawed individuals. Joe's story is not just his own, but he is a reflection of the world we live in and a call to action for all of us to do better, to be better. Now, it's time for sleep. See you tomorrow.